We now turn to Nicaragua as the political unrest continues to spread across the country and the international outrage at President Ortega continues to grow. Within 2 days of President Daniel Ortega making claims that things were getting better in Nicaragua, 4 more people were killed on Tuesday, including a Brazilian medical student whose car was shot up by pro-government civilians who recently took over a university. Now joining us is the Mexico bureau chief at the Washington Post, Joshua Partlow. He's been following this story. Joshua, thanks for joining us. President Ortega claims things are getting better, but people keep dying. Has there been any improvement at all?
No, I don't think so. I think the underlying situation remains pretty much the same as it has been for the last 3 months. There's massive opposition to President Ortega's government. There's unrest in the streets, and there's continuing to be a lot of violence.
So, Joshua, after the Brazilian student was killed in clashes, Brazil recalled its ambassador to Nicaragua. Clearly, international outrage is mounting. Is President Ortega not getting the message?
Yeah, I think President Ortega has been pretty defiant through this whole process. There were initially, after the initial wave of protests, there were some rounds of dialogue, but since then that has fallen apart as the violence has intensified. President Ortega has refused to consider the possibility of early elections or leaving his position. So I think Nicaragua is still at a standoff.
So, Joshua, you have witnessed the violence firsthand there in Nicaragua. You've seen the aftermath from a shooting at a church. We've also seen deadly violence at universities. Based on what you saw, how far do you think Ortega and his forces are willing to go?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last few weeks is that his government is willing to use as much force as necessary to try to break these protests. The protesters had taken over universities, whole towns and cities with barricades, bricks and logs, and not trying to block the police from entering cities. And over the last few weeks, the paramilitary forces that are loyal to Ortega's government have gone in convoys of trucks with rifles and military weapons and started shooting and have basically driven those protesters out of those areas, and they've essentially taken back control of most of the areas that the protesters had seized. So now you're at a position where we're waiting to see how the protesters will respond to that and whether this paramilitary violence will continue.
And are the protesters armed? Where are they getting their weapons?
The protesters are armed in some cases with homemade mortars. You see those a lot. The protesters that I was with in the church that came under attack, I would say out of a couple hundred people, I saw 3 or 4 guns, pistols, arms like that.
Right.
Those mortar tubes, and then spikes, sticks, rocks. It's a lot of improvised weapons.
So there's a clear imbalance here. It doesn't sound like they will be able to keep up for long if Ortega is determined to send in these, military and paramilitary groups.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And the paramilitary groups seem to have fairly modern military weapons, military rifles, and the death toll so far, the vast majority of the more than 350 people who have been killed have been civilians.
Right. And of course, there's no way that, stones and sticks can compete with that kind of advanced military equipment. Now, Joshua, I want to ask you, the State Department has condemned the Ortega regime. It's called for free and fair elections. Vice President Mike Pence also echoed these demands today in a tweet. Do you think the State Department could be doing more?
You've also seen the State Department impose some sanctions on top Nicaraguan officials and leaders of the security forces. So you might see more of that. Mm-hmm. You could see more intensive sanctions. Beyond that, I'm not sure what other options they're considering at this point.
Sure. What do you think would stop the Ortega regime at this point?
It's hard to say. There's been a pretty widespread uprising across the country, including business leaders who were his his former allies. A lot of people have turned on the Ortega government. So, it's hard to know. It's hard to know what it would take for him to change his approach.
All right, Joshua Partlow, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you.